Thank you so much, Seraphim, for that very generous introduction. And I also want to thank all the organizations and staff members supporting this event. And of course, thank you all for coming. I've never seen so many people attending a philosophy talk. Of course, my talk will go beyond philosophy itself. And a lot of this will be quite personal. But let me begin by honoring the memory of three particular philosophers who have inspired my approach in this talk and in my recent work more generally. And they are Charles Mills, Bell Hooks, and Henry Allison. Unfortunately, I never met Charles Mills or Bell Hooks. So from these thinkers, I learned, first of all, not to be cynical when I criticize historical figures and think about the historical legacies of racism. And I also benefited a great deal from reading Bell Hooks' works on love, community building, and liberatory pedagogy. And I have tried my best to incorporate those insights into my scholarly and teaching practices. And of course, to my beloved late advisor, Henry Allison, who always encouraged me to be courageous to say controversial things, even when he disagreed with me. So the plan of today's talk has two parts. So first of all, I'll say a little bit about the main title of the talk. The main title is Moving Through Racism with Love. So what do I mean by racism in this context? And why do I say we should move through it? And why we should do so with love and what kind of love? And then I'll move on to elaborate on the subtitle of the book. The subtitle is What I Learned from Studying Kant and Racism. So I'll begin by talking about a little bit of personal history about how I moved through Kant's racism, first with a bit of self-love as a woman of color, and then with a bit of loving understanding toward Kant. And then next, I'll talk about Kant's own race thinking. In particular, I want to highlight how he approached the racist practices in his own time with the indifference of what he called a philosophical historian. I highlight indifference here because I think of love as opposed not so much to hate, but to indifference, at least in this particular context. And then from that bit of understanding of Kant's race thinking, I want to draw some lessons for us scholars today as to how we should relate to racism as a kind of historically inherited condition, whether we like it or not. And then I'll talk about why and how to move through this kind of racism with love, and what does that mean? Okay, so let me just quickly go through some of the preliminary stuff indicated in the main title. So I'll talk about move through racism with love. What do I mean by racism? This itself is a very complicated topic, of course. And so you can write a whole book about, what do I mean by racism? So I looked around on the internet and to see what I can find something quick and easy. It was not easy to find a satisfying account of racism that's pertinent to my talk today. And so what I ended up finding is this account of racism that was presented by a city of Seattle, which is one of the most progressive cities in the US. The City of Seattle Office for Civil Rights published this account of racism in 2021. It's publicly available. And what I like about this account of racism is, first of all, it recognizes just how complex racism is, how many dimensions there is. So it talks about four major aspects of racism. And includes interpersonal, internalized, institutional, and structural. And another thing about this kind of racism is that it de-emphasizes personal intentions, but it emphasizes the structural aspect of racism. And it talks a lot about racism in terms of the distribution of power. and talks a lot about racism as a historically inherited condition. So draws our attention to the historical, social, and ideological conditions of racism. And so I really like this particular part. And another thing that I like about this account is that it draws attention to internalized racism. And this is the aspect of racism we often do not talk about. And this part means a lot to me as a Chinese, as someone of Chinese descent. I'll probably circle back to this part later. And so next, why do I say we should move through racism with love? And what I mean by that is that there's simply no getting around it, and there's no avoiding it. That's my view. And especially considering that I'm thinking of racism as a historically inherited condition. And I talk about moving through racism. By that, I mean that it's an active and probably very slow process, and we need a lot of patience, and we need to take it one step at a time. And also moving through racism can be intellectually, morally, and emotionally demanding. I'll talk a little bit about the demandingness of this process later on. But for now, I will say precisely because it's a demanding thing to do, I want to talk about moving through it with love. Now the question is, what do I mean by love? So in this context, I want to talk about what the Sikh, S-I-K-H, a Sikh activist, Valerie Kaur, presented as revolutionary love in her fairly recent book, See No Stranger. And so what Valerie Kaur thinks of revolutionary love is as follows. So first, Valerie Kaur thinks that, the kind of love we talk about here that we need in order to move through racist practices is not just a feeling, but a choice to enter into wonder and labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves in order to transform the world around us. And this emphasis on transformative love connects with the theme of social change that would run through my talk. And this kind of choice, according to Kaur, is not only moral, but also strategic, demanding, and disciplined. And this is the part I really like about her account. Now, I'll highlight a few other aspects of this account of revolutionary love. First of all, I'll begin with love for oneself. And the reason I begin with that is because this is a really important as a kind of grounding, in virtue of its grounding effect for people of color, or for the historically marginalized, dehumanized, etc. groups in general. Because what this does is that you can love yourself as unconditionally worthy so that you don't need other people to validate you. And I think this kind of affective state allows the people of color, for instance, to live in this world, as Valerie Kaur puts it, without the burden of hate. In other words, it's life-giving for those of us who feel who are historically marginalized or even dehumanized. And next, I will move on to love for another. So in this context, love for another must go hand in hand with understanding. And this connection between love and understanding runs through all sorts of spiritual traditions. And here I find it particularly helpful to turn to Martin Luther King's notion of love for the so-called, the ones who oppress you, so to speak. And King thinks that the kind of love for those people who we say describe as oppressors cannot be a sentimental or affectionate emotion, because he thinks it would be nonsense to urge people to love their oppressors in an affectionate sense. Rather, love in this connection, according to Kant, means understanding, redemptive goodwill, or what he calls agape, to borrow the Greek notion of love. And so what is kind of love, understanding love, that allows us to do, first of all, or entails, is first of all, to see another person's humanity, even if they deny our own. Of course, here, Valerie Cowell is speaking from the perspective of a woman of color. So she specifically emphasizes seeing the oppressor's humanity, even if they deny our own. And Cowell here, like Kin, is thinking about a strategic kind of love, because she is thinking about the revolutionary, transformative love. And she would agree that only what is understood can be transformed. So in order to understand, you really first have to listen deeply across differences with an open-minded curiosity, or what Cowell calls wonder, even when, or I would say especially when, the other side holds abhorrent or even dangerous beliefs. So you want to understand where they come from, at least, and to understand specifically the cultural forces and institutional practices that facilitated those beliefs. And the last aspect of Cowell's account of revolutionary love I want to emphasize is her view that love is never indifferent. As I mentioned earlier, in this talk, I want to think of the opposite of love as not so much hatred as indifference. So love is never indifferent, according to Cowell, because it actually demands and orients us toward concrete actions to bring about social, cultural, and institutional changes and make the world a more just and more loving place for everyone. And also, without love, we may stop short at feeling bad for a group of people and then continue to participate in the structures and systems that oppress them. By contrast, love induces what Cowell calls divine rage as systems of oppression. Notice that we're talking about systems of oppression. We're not talking about particular individuals. So it's the kind of rage, according to Cowell, that is precise and purposeful and hence constructive and not merely destructive. It calls us to reimagine the world and focuses our energy on moving steadily towards the reimagined future. And this kind of process also requires that you be strategic. And this takes me to the last aspect of revolutionary love I want to talk about, which is Kant's insight that love has to be combined with power. As Kant famously puts it, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against the love. And that I love that quote. I'll come back to the point about power at the end of the talk. Now I'll move on to the second part of my presentation. So I want to I'll begin by talking about my own personal experience trying to move through Kant's racism. So to give you a little bit of context, you have to understand what the status quo is in mainstream Kant scholarship with respect to Kant's race thinking. So you can basically tell from all the major encyclopedic entries on Kant that the racialist and the racist aspect of Kant's thinking is basically invisible in the mainstream scholarship. So these major encyclopedic entries, some of which are very recently updated, either don't mention Kant's views on race at all, or they would mention Kant's so-called scientific account of human races in passing without any comments on either this particular aspect of Kant's race thinking or the explicitly racist dimension of his thinking. So one result of this kind of invisibility is what I call a blissfully ignorant me. So I completed my PhD education in 2012 and I started working as an assistant professor at Georgetown University that same year. And I received tenure in 2018. And through all that time, I was just ignorant about Kant's race thinking. And I probably heard rumors, so to speak, about the fact that he held racist views, but like a lot of my fellow Kant scholars, I assumed that there was nothing there serious to think about, and it was not philosophical enough to consider. So I stayed in this condition, this condition of ignorance through middle of 2019. And then I so-called accidentally encountered some serious public discussions about Kant's racism. I'll spare you the details, but anyhow, it was in the middle of 2019 at this American Philosophical Association's Central Divisional meeting where I ran into a public discussion of Kant's racism. And it had huge impact on me. And I went through all sorts of emotions. I was shocked. I felt ashamed about my own ignorance. And I felt a sense of grief. And I also went through an intellectual as well as moral crisis. And but then I eventually decided I needed to be healed by myself through writing and understanding. And I wanted to do so with a forward-looking vision. And so that led me to this book that Seraphim mentioned in the introduction. So the way I handled this topic has a lot to do with my personal, who I am, so to speak. So I am what the Americans call a woman of color. I was also raised with a Buddhist worldview. And this is actually why I found Kao's account of revolutionary love particularly empowering. And that's also why I begin by talking about self-love as a kind of grounding affect for a woman of color, because this really allowed me to live, to move on without the burden of resentment, and to move through some of the racist writings in Kant without feeling degraded, so to speak, even though you could see my so-called yellow race being denigrated repeatedly in Kant's work. I found this particularly important. And next, my Buddhist upbringing would also emphasize the connection between love and understanding. And so this allowed me to kind of practice a kind of intellectual empathy towards Kant, even with respect to his racist writings. And lastly, but not least, is that love, the kind of love that we're talking about here, is never indifferent. And it allows me, or focuses my vision forward, and it orients me toward action. So that's why my book actually ends with a forward-looking conclusion, because I really want to find ways to move forward with all that. And so I often say that this book is my truth and reconciliation with Kant. And I recognize that the point of my criticism, or I should remind myself, I constantly reminded myself that the point of my criticism is never to tear down, but always to build up better. Or as Charles Mills puts it, you have to do two things at once, hold two things at once in your heart. One is, first, you have to honestly get it right. And then you have to have this forward-looking vision about how to make it right. And these are aspirations of us philosophers. Okay, so let me kind of move through that. With first bit is a little bit of so-called get the truth part. I want to look at Kant's own race thinking, and I really particularly want to look at where he came from, and how he, in particular, moved through the racist practices in his time with the indifference of a philosophical historian. And I talk about this aspect of his practice in order to draw some lessons for us who wish to move forward to a better world. Okay, so first, I want to say that contrary to the common assumption about how to think about Kant's racist thinking, I do not think that Kant's racist thinking is simply in contradiction with the so-called good core of his philosophical system. Rather, I think that I take seriously the fact that Kant was an ingenious, systematic thinker, and he could find ways to fit in his race thinking. And by race thinking, I also mean to include the racist dimension of his thinking. So, in particular, one of the most important things I did in my book is to show that Kant's system is very complicated and it's very intricate, and gives Kant a lot of room to generate the so-called racist aspect of his thinking. So the most important part is to tease apart different levels of discourse by looking at Kant's method of abstraction. If anyone is interested, I'll talk a little bit more about Kant's particular method of abstraction, which is different from classical kind of abstraction. And so, but I'll skip the technical details here. What I want to say here is that Kant's system has these different levels of discourse that he could separate, and before he eventually connected them, by means of abstraction, or what I call real abstraction. And each level of these discourses has a particular notion of human being attached to it. So at the highest and most abstract level, you have Kant's pure moral philosophy, which he first developed in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. At this level, Kant is thinking about human being in an extremely abstract way, as mere human beings as such, in abstraction from their concrete conditions of embodiment. And then Kant recognized that this level of abstraction is not enough for his complete moral theory. So he would come down to the level of pragmatic anthropology. And this level is a little bit more concrete, but it's still a little bit of abstract. So at this level, Kant thinks of human being in terms of a free acting, yet to be perfected rational animal. It's a particular species. And then again, that's still a little bit of abstract, because when Kant talks about species, he's not talking about an aggregate of concrete human beings, but rather he's talking about species in general. So then he comes down to a more specific level, which is the level of physical geography. This is an area that he held lifelong interest in, and he taught this subject, as many of you probably already know. Kant taught physical geography for 4 decades, and this is the place where Kant talks about human beings as spatio-temporally particularized inhabitants on Earth, and this is also the level at which Kant's race thinking get off the ground. Now, what allows Kant to bring these levels together and and get to the so-called racist aspect of his thinking is his teleological conception of history. So Kant recognizes that the moral vision he laid down in the groundwork, for example, is extremely abstract, and also it's not yet reality. So it has to be realized by human species over a long period of time. So Kant is thinking about how the human species could get there over time. So Kant can think in abstraction that every human being, as a member of species, has a certain kind of innate germs or chimer for moral development. But these germs have to be developed over time under certain conditions. And these conditions include both external conditions, such as political situation, and internal conditions. And these internal conditions, according to Kant's anthropology, include things like inner drive, certain affects and passions, and the ability to form abstract concepts and principles. And this is the part where Kant's race thinking comes in, because Kant thinks that the distribution of these inner conditions are unequal across along the racial lines. And so Kant thinks that if you need, say, certain drives and passions in order to, leave the state of nature, for example, and to get this whole process of moral development started, Kant thinks that there is a particular race that lacks these drives and passions. This is represented by the so-called the red race, represented by the Amerindians. So, and then next comes to the black race, and next comes to the yellow race, and they all lack also all sorts of internal conditions. And by contrast, the white race possesses all drives and talents. And so what Kant eventually gives us is this picture that connects race and destiny. So basically, if the moral germs need time to develop, if human species has to go through all these stages before it can be moralized eventually, then according to Kant's race theory, you have all these non-white races who, for lack of all sorts of internal conditions of development, are stuck in the past of the history, whereas by contrast, the white race alone possesses all sorts of drives, all sorts of passions, all sorts of talents that allow them to be cultivated and civilized and eventually moralized. And so one thing I also want to emphasize here is that I'm not just talking about Kant's own race thinking. It's not just about what Kant himself thought. And this is the second aspect of my book that allows me to move beyond the current discourse on Kant and racism. This is the place I emphasize that Kant was not just thinking in his own head. Rather, he was thinking and talking and presenting his views out loud in front of others. And he was a powerful social actor who was situated in the nexus of power relations and meaning-making agents. And he was a social actor who was specifically a prominent scholar and a lifelong educator. And this latter aspect, unfortunately, is often not taken seriously enough. So this is also the context in which I want to emphasize that Kant presented a lot of those views in front of his students for decades. Okay, so, and then another thing that's worth emphasizing is the fact that Kant developed his race thinking against a specific historical context. And the historical context includes not only colonial violence, but also racial slavery. So here I want to emphasize the racial slavery part. And this is the part I want to tease out my observation that Kant moved through the racist practices in his time with indifference of a philosophical historian. So here's what Kant, the moral philosopher, could say in abstracto. So as we all know, if you know anything about Kant's moral philosophy at all, you know the formula of humanity. This basically asks that you do not use humanity either in your own person or in the person of any other as mere means, right? So by this principle, Kant could say, although he never said, that it's morally wrong for one human being to use another as a slave, namely as a mere means. So this is what his abstract moral philosophy would tell us. But on the other hand, Kant also held the perspective of what he calls a disinterested philosophical historian. And so from this particular perspective, Kant can think of racial slavery as a stage of history. And in addition, given his theory of race, he can say the Black race is uniquely suited for that stage. So here we see a contrast between two different viewpoints. On the one hand, you can think of the moral viewpoint. On the other hand, you can think of the so-called philosophical historical viewpoint. So basically, for any event, as far as Kant is concerned, that took place in space of time, he could judge it either on its own by certain moral principles or in relation to other events or actions, etc., from a purely historical standpoint. So in that way, an event, a historical event, can be judged either as immoral from the first standpoint or get a pass from the second. So he can be judged as a more immoral from the first standpoint, but still get a pass from the second. And Kant, you would see, Kant gives a lot of room for holding this thought in his mind. So the key distinction here, I already alluded to early on, is the distinction between the so-called species and individuals. So for Kant, this is a Kant in his important essay, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Aim, published in 1784, right before he published the groundwork. So Kant says, what meets the eye in individual subjects as confused and irregular, yet in the whole species, can be recognized as a steadily progressing through, though slow development of its original predispositions. And here, importantly for Kant, species is not an aggregate of individuals. So what is true of the species may not be true of the individuals. So by species, Kant means temporally extended series of generations. And so because of this distinction between species and aggregate of individuals, Kant wants to say that he wants to focus on the species. So he can say that if all natural predispositions, which is similar to the germs I mentioned earlier, if all natural predispositions of humanity are determined sometime to develop themselves completely and purposively, namely to realize particularly realize the humanity's moral potential, this complete development can be realized only in a species, but not in the individual. So this distinction will allow Kant to focus on the species. And he'll say his perspective as what he calls a disinterested philosopher is to regard human beings and their play in the large. In other words, Kant says, he is going to consider not the aims of individuals, but an aim of nature in this nonsensical course of things human. So this kind of perspective allows Kant to feel reasonable in being preoccupied with the species-bound destiny of humanity while abstracting away or looking away from individual sufferings in concreto. And here, the kind of individual suffering, the most atrocious individual sufferings I'm talking about here in this particular context is racial slavery, and Kant could look away from that. And this is what I meant by saying that Kant was moving through the racist practices of his time with indifference. And this connects with my earlier point about the opposite of love being indifference as opposed to mere hate. Okay, so, and Kant, I think a lot of times, I think this kind of indifference, I don't want to attribute something, evil in Kant's heart, but rather what I notice is that Kant could move through the racist practices in his time with indifference in a way that speaks to his reason. And here I have this quote from Rousseau, which I think captures this point particularly well. So to quote Rousseau, "It is reason that separates man from everything that troubles and afflicts him. It is philosophy that isolates him. By means of philosophy, he secretly says, at the sight of a suffering man, perish if you wish, I am safe. Only dangers that threaten the entire society would disturb the philosopher's tranquil slumber and rouse him from his bed." Now, that last bit also actually can also capture the claim that Kant later, very late in his career, supposedly changed his view about slavery. I'm not elaborating here. I have a separate paper on this particular topic. So when Kant later did decide to say something critically about slavery, it would still not be out of concern for those suffering individuals, but rather because he recognized a certain threat to the society as he envisions it. But for now, I want to move on to the last part of my talk. So as I said earlier, I gave this particular understanding of Kant's relationship to racism so that we can learn something valuable from that particular understanding. So I want to see, given what I have just said, what we as scholars should relate to racism as a historically inherited condition, and why I think we must move through it with love, and specifically with the kind of revolutionary love that Valerie Kaur was talking about. So where do we scholars go from here? You can see this title is inspired by Martin Luther King's last speech. Where do we go from here? So I'll go through this part quite quickly, and also do not want to prescribe anything to anyone. This is me thinking through this issue myself. And in a way, this is a reminder to myself as a scholar. So first of all, recall that my working definition of racism encompasses a lot of aspects, and it's really complicated and takes a lot to understand what exactly is involved in racist practices. And so I want to say the first step is that undoing racist structures, practices, and mindsets is epistemically demanding. And so for that reason, we need to put in what King calls a mass effort to re-educate ourselves out of our racial ignorance, regardless of where we are, regardless of what position we occupy. We all have a share of racial ignorance. I have a lot of personal stories to tell you about my own very embarrassing sometimes manifestations of racial ignorance. We just have to figure out how to educate ourselves better. And in particular, as King says, nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And I have to say that I myself embodies that now and then, and still today. Okay. And in this regard, I also want to warn against a merely abstract and purportedly colorblind version of egalitarianism. if we really care about racial equality and justice, I think we should also study the non-ideal conditions of inequality and injustice in concreto. And as King would say, right, loose and easy language about equality sounds good to our ears, but we need to show that we really care. We have to give some credibility to our talk about equality. And that demands that we learn and we study about the non-ideal conditions under which inequality and injustice show up in concreto. And doing all that work can be emotionally demanding as well. As I shared with you early on, I went through all sorts of emotional states, and they were not pleasant states to be in. And what I learned is that we can learn a lot from our affective states. We can sometimes feel defensive. We can sometimes feel afraid. We can sometimes feel anger or grief, all sorts of things. What we need to do is to pay attention and learn from, pay attention to and learn from our affective states, non-judgmentally or with a little bit of self-love. And also, it's important to know that it's not just about you individually. And again, here to borrow Valerie Carroll's insight that I quoted earlier, the kind of love we're talking about is a choice to enter into labor for others. It's not meant to be easy. And it's not meant to be just about you, but we have to labor for everyone because everyone will have to be included in the world we strive to remake. Okay, and finally, I want to circle back to this point about the relationship between love and power. Right, as King said, love without power is merely sentimental and anemic. And sometimes you need to recognize that sometimes your social position comes with a certain kind of position of power. If you do have that, I suggest that we should use it well and use it to assist others and to lift others, and to do so with what King calls a spirit of creative altruism. And don't underestimate that the fact that we all have power, regardless where we are. And no one is completely powerless. And maybe I'm being naive about this, but at the very least, we can find creative ways to build what the philosopher Robin Jun talked about as solidarity, as collective power from below. And by the way, I recommend anything that Robin Jun has published on this topic, and her work is fascinating for those of you who are interested in social change. Okay, and then lastly, and this part is dear to me as an educator. If you're also an educator, I suggest that you treat your classroom as a site of intervention and teach to transgress. This is something I borrowed from Bell Hooks. Namely, you can treat your teaching as a liberatory, transformative, and empowering practice. And I can vouch for that kind of practice. And I have felt very empowered myself by approaching teaching this way. And I have also drawn a lot of joy from approaching teaching that way. And wherever you are, and this circles back to Charles Mill's insight that we should never be cynical and that we should never give up too soon, at least not without trying really hard. And so let's just practice all this with a bit of radical hope and with a bit of active hope. And thank you for your attention.